Hi students, welcome to Science Extension and Module 1, the Foundations of Scientific Thinking. This is video number 7, and we're going to explore a little bit of Indigenous cultural knowledge in this video. The learning goal or learning intention is that you can use historical examples to evaluate the contribution of cultural observational knowledge and its relationship to science, including post-49,000 BCE, exemplified by Aboriginal cultures. So what we want to do in this video is just have a little bit of a think about what Aboriginal science actually means, the applications of Indigenous science, particularly to areas like astronomy and ecology or sustainability, and to think about how or to what extent we can actually describe these processes as actual parts of science. So we want to have a bit of a think about where the practices of Aboriginal communities actually overlaps with our understanding of what science is. There's a number of really good sources around. There's a really nice series that starts to look at some of the science of Aboriginal cultures of the different countries that make up Australia. And I think one of the things that's really important when you're going through this little body of work is that you think very much about the country that you're on. Pay my respect to the Indigenous people of the Worimi country. That's the country that I'm speaking to you from today. It's also a country in which I teach. And there's a very rich and very long history of activity of people in this area. They have managed the land for a very long period of time, and the stories are fascinating stories, and they have just a little bit more of a connection when you're actually on the same land. So one of the problems that sometimes we have when we approach the study of Indigenous science is we talk about Indigenous science. And actually what we need to talk about is country. We need to talk about the specifics of the mobs that are on the land that you are on, that your students are on, and that you can think about in terms of exactly what is going on in your local area, or what are some of the real key stories. Now that means there's a lot of stuff that we can read, but because the nature of Aboriginal cultures in general is to pass on oral histories, you need to talk to people. You actually need to get in touch with some of the local elders, with some of the people who have had those stories passed on to them, and ask to see whether or not they are prepared to share those stories with you. There is a richness that is created by understanding some of the local stories and to be able to link them to the sort of things that we're looking at as part of our study of the foundations of scientific thinking. So you can find a lot of information about Indigenous science, and not just Australian. Obviously, I'm going to contextualise what I'm saying with in terms of Aboriginal stories, because that's the local group here in Australia. But there are cultures from all over the world that have developed different views of nature throughout human history. Most of them are rooted in traditional systems of beliefs which Indigenous people use to understand and interpret their biophysical environment. These systems of managing the environment constitute an integral part of the cultural identity and social integrity of many Indigenous populations. At the same time, their knowledge embodies a wealth of wisdom and experience of nature gained over millennia from direct observations and transmitted most often orally over generations. Now, one of the things that's really important when we read quotes like this and when we think about some of the stories that we're going to look at is the fact that we need to think about what is our definition of science? What have we talked about so far in terms of the philosophy of science, in terms of what constitutes science and what doesn't? And we've talked about things like observation, empiricism, the ability to actually carry out experiments or to take careful observations and to look for patterns, and actually to do more than that, to start to make predictions and then to test those predictions to see if they are supported by the observations that you then make or whether they are not supported. And of course, good science is also collaborative, so it's something that is built in community. It's also something that is communicated over the generations. Our scientific understanding has come to us not from the science that's being done just right now, but from the science that's been done over hundreds of years. So keep that in mind when we're looking at some of these definitions and some of these stories, to think about whether or not this is actually examples of good science. So one of the things that we're going to explore both in this video and the next one is cultural knowledge. Observations plus relationship plus discussion creates deep knowledge. These are the sorts of things that are part of what we've discussed as the ways in which science works. Observations are made, understandings are reached as a result of those observations, or predictions are made based on those observations. They're communicated, they're tested, other people test them and see whether or not there is a consistency around the knowledge that has been gained. And we see this knowledge construction being linked to cultural constructs. So what we call science is very European. It's very recent. It's really scientific revolution stuff. Galileo and Copernicus, I guess you could include in there as well. And a lot of the data that was taken by people like Kepler to, I guess, tell us something about how we do science. And yet science potentially covers a number of areas that link into this traditional cultural knowledge. And partly that's because the observations are massive. And we're going to talk in this course about big data sets, about lots and lots of data. And the more data that we have, the more that we can analyze that data, the more confident we can be with our results. Most of these indigenous cultural practices have happened over thousands and thousands of years. That's a lot of observations. That's big data sets. And that means that over that time, the testing of ideas, the sharing of inferences, over all parts in Australia, we think that probably around 400 different nations. They had different languages and different cultural practices. I think one of the things that's very hard for Australians like me to get our head around sometimes is if you look at Europe, for example, the size of Europe, the number of countries in Europe, the number of languages that are spoken, the number of different types of cultural expectations, the history that's been created in each of those different countries is very unique. We don't talk about Europeans and think that they are all one type of culture and language and history, and yet we do that with our Indigenous people, with the Aboriginal people in Australia, and they're not. They are likewise lots of nations, lots of country, lots of language, lots of experience, lots of observations, and the science that they've been doing has happened on a huge range of different places, from close to the equator in the far north of Queensland and the Torres Strait Islands, down to Tasmania, where it gets very, very cold. And the range of different types of climate and habitat are so very different, and Aboriginal groups have been very good at being able to manage all of these different types of environments over thousands of years. So I mentioned that in Aboriginal science, we're looking at two common areas where traditional science informs Western science, and these are in the areas of astronomy and ecology, and it's of critical importance to understand the patterns of life, the changing of the seasons, and how to balance the present needs of the group with their future needs, which is the essence of sustainable practice. I suggest that if you haven't already done this, there is a little set of science topic cards, and they are absolutely fantastic. There is a huge amount of information that's on these little cards, but they're also a very good starter. And I've just given you a little snapshot of 3 of these, along with a map that identifies the source of these. And one of the things that I have learned is around land links. So in my school, we've done a lot of work on the 8 ways pedagogy, and we've tried to understand a little bit more about how knowledge is constructed and passed on, and the ways in which different people learn. And just as all teachers, I think, are always trying to ensure that their classes are inclusive, that all students are challenged, but also supported where they are needed, and that's a big job. One of the things that's very important is to think about the way that we teach. And the 8 ways pedagogy is a fantastic way of thinking about how you deliver the lessons that you teach. But the other thing that's important for us is that there are a number of different areas, 8 of them in fact, hence the 8 ways, that give us a reference point where we can start to think about how we do this. And one thing that's been made very clear to me is to try and focus a little bit more on the source of knowledge. So whilst I'm on Worimi land, I'm not only obtaining the information that I'm going to share with you in this video from Worimi culture. So here, for example, in Riley Kelly, which is a really great website to go and explore some great resources there. This is Dunghutti country, and that's the source of this particular knowledge, this particular information. And you'll notice that each of these little cards And I've given you some examples of them here, but I'll give you one specific one if I take one out. So here's my little set of cards. You can see this is the Aboriginal fish traps one, so it's the one that you can see, and on the back there is some information that is provided. And as I say, I think these are a great activity for you to take a card and then explore the local knowledge around that particular area that you've been looking at. So you can see Aboriginal fish traps. Brewarrina, for example, is particularly well known for these particular engineering structures. As I've mentioned in the previous slide, astronomy and ecology are two really important areas where traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge has played a great part in increasing our understanding of what's going on the land. So if we look first at Aboriginal astronomy, then we might describe Aboriginal science as the practical application of culturally derived theories of knowledge about the nature of the world and its impacts on everyday life. And so this has actually been studied and has its own discipline, which is ethnoastronomy. And that is defined basically as the study of the astronomical practices and beliefs of contemporary cultures with a focus on Indigenous people. It relies heavily on the ethnographic and historical records. Most of those, of course, are oral, and involves learning about human understanding of the sky directly from the people themselves. And this knowledge is particularly centered around Indigenous elders who pass it on from generation to generation. And this is why this is such a valuable resource. And it's worth remembering too that if you're not a part of the local community, of the local culture, you need to make sure that you establish those links, and you need to remember that first is relationship, second is knowledge. And it's very important that we establish those relationships, that we make the connections, and that we feel like we're part of the community, and therefore we may well be trusted with information. So it's really important that we establish those relationships, and therefore we understand not only the information that we're acquiring, but also how appropriate it is to share then with others. I do have to put up this warning for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that the embedded video does contain images and voices of a deceased person. I'm not going to play this video for you, but I think it's really important that you do have a look. This is, again, a local one. The stories are critical to our understanding not just of culture, but also the way in which we interpret both some of the astronomical features that have been identified by the local people, but also some of the ways that they manage sustainably the environment in which they're found. So one of the best ones is the relationship between, in the local context, is the relationship between the emu in the sky, and this is actually an interesting one when you look at the interpretations. A lot of Western astronomy is based on looking at the stars, the shiny bits of the sky, and trying to interpret patterns or shapes or motion and understand how that occurs. But this is more about the dark spaces between the light. And so that's where the emu in the sky has basically come from, looking at the darker patches that have been described by the patterns of light and obviously the Milky Way that you can see there as well. And this has tracked an emu, basically, the general shape of an emu at different stages throughout the year. Local people recognise too the relationship between the different positions of the emu throughout the year and a food like the quandong. And the linking of some of the things that are seen in the natural world, whether they're part of migration patterns, whether they're when particular types of plants are flowering, or when particular types of animals are starting to have babies, or whether it's different features that are appearing or disappearing from the night sky. Each of these has then been linked to other cycles that actually allow Aboriginal people to predict when certain types of plants might be flowering, when they might be fruiting, when certain foods might be available, and for how long they might be available. And this is also linked to things like the eggs that are being produced by the emus, when they can be harvested and for how long, and in such a way that they are maintaining a sustainable environment where they're not going to basically farm the eggs until there are no emus left, but they're going to make sure that they do it in such a way that it maximizes the interaction between all the components of the ecosystem. Now, this is ecosystem in balance, and that's one of the things that we've talked about in science a lot, is the sustainability of the environment in which we find ourselves. So there's some really interesting stories that are part of this. There's quite a few that have been published, and this is one of the things that is really worth you reading as part of this little section of work. Different mobs around Australia have different, slightly different interpretations, and some of the links obviously are around the local food sources. So you'll find some slight variations depending on where you live for the stories for the local mob. So this is where I encourage you very much to look at your local context and talk to the elders that you have in your area and find out some of these stories and the way in which this knowledge has been built over time. So we do have to reach a conclusion about all of this stuff, though. When we start to think about this, when we start to explore some of these issues, we need to actually ask ourselves the question, is it science? Can we call traditional knowledge science? If we accept that traditional knowledge is based on collaboration and communication, it's based on observation and repetition, it's looking for patterns over not just days but years, it's about connection to the land and respect for the land, and it's about the empirical application of knowledge, it's sounding a little bit like what we've already defined science to be, to me. Does it carry out experiments? Does it test hypotheses? Not in a traditional sense, no. But it does answer a lot of those areas, or at least it ticks a number of those boxes that we've listed as part of our definition of science. I can't answer this question for you because I think it's an important question for you to think about yourself. Is traditional knowledge science actual science? Or is there something else going on here which is of incredible value but wouldn't necessarily sit under our banner of what is science? I'll leave you with a thought that you might want to explore in a little bit more detail. Indigenous science is the science that Indigenous peoples developed independently of Western science. If we understand Indigenous to relate to people who have a long-standing and complex relationship with a local area, and science to mean a systematic approach to acquiring knowledge of the natural world, then Indigenous science is the process by which Indigenous peoples build their empirical knowledge of their natural environment. Thanks for watching.